Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Unconnected.org's new webinar series brought to you by our wonderful sponsors at the GSR Foundation. During this series, we'll be taking a deep dive into how the digital divide intersects with a variety of different industries and how it affects various different communities. I'm delighted to introduce you to two very special guests who are experts within the mobile money sphere, with whom we'll be discussing the relationship between the fintech sector and the digital inclusion space. Before I do so, let me just quickly introduce myself. So my name is Danny Weiser. I'm a freelance journalist, and my passion for wanting to support the mission of digital inclusion has brought me close to unconnected.org. And so I have the pleasure of hosting these webinar discussions over the course of the next few weeks and months, in which we can hopefully move the conversation forward as to how we can bring about an effective change to the world, one connection at a time. So let me start by just telling you a little bit about my amazing guests. So first, we have Nanthini Hariharishura, who is a digital economy, digital finance, and inclusion expert calling in from North Carolina, I believe. Nanthini, if you want to give us a wave. And we are also delighted to be joined by Bart-Jan Paus, who until recently was the Senior Director for Mobile Money at GSMA. Thank you both so much for joining me today. For any future guests keen to appear on the show, bear in mind that we will start each episode by asking the same $1 million question before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of each individual industry. So I'm going to ask both Bart-Jan and Anthony to introduce themselves and to answer the question, what does meaningful digital connection look like to you? Bart-Jan, should we kick off with you?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. It's a great pleasure and very much looking forward to have this discussion and help Unconnected to connect people. What does meaningful connection mean, to go straight into your question, right? I think, and that maybe connects to my personal background. For me, if I look at that, there's a very strong correlation between digital connection and financial connection. Just also because of my background working on the interface between mobile and financial services. So if we look at connection for a start, and then I'm tapping from my experience working at the GSMA, which is the global organization for the mobile industry, I think it would be, as a starting point for the conversation, maybe good to deep dive a little bit into what the current level of connectivity in the world actually looks like. Because as published by my colleagues or former colleagues in the annual state of the mobile industry connectivity report, currently more than half of the world's population is connected to the internet, to the mobile internet primarily, but that means that 43% of the world's population is actually not connected. So that's a huge fraction of the population. And if you look into that, I think it's very common for people to think that that is a matter of connectivity per se, right? People just don't have access to the network. But if you look into it, actually, that only accounts for 5% of these people. Still a very large amount of people. We're talking 400 million people that do not have connectivity. But that means that the remainder of that, 38%, that's 3 billion people, are in principle covered by network, whatever network we're speaking of. But they're still not connected. And that's what we refer to as the usage gap. So that, I think, is a very important first step into answering your question. What does meaningful connectivity refer to? It's not only allowing people access to the network, it's about driving usage. And I think that's an important conversation to have. What drives usage? What brings relevance to people so they actually start connecting to the internet? So there's these two components to it, connectivity itself and usage.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jambo. Nanthini, can you come in and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then also try to tackle that challenging question? What does it mean? What does meaningful connectivity mean, Rob?
Thank you. I'm Nandini Harihareshwara, or Nandini, whatever is easier to pronounce. I am a digital finance, digital economy, and inclusion expert. I've worked in 25 plus countries in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, trying to drive increased access to digital and financial products for marginalized people for a long time. So it's my pleasure to meet all of you and talk to you about this very important topic. I This question that Danny, you prompt us to think about before we talking about it today was, what does meaningful connectivity mean, right? To me. And so I thought about this, and many, 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 many years ago, I was working in Zambia, and I was helping to work with the ecosystem to increase access to digital financial services, along with my colleague here. And one of the things that we talked about there that we termed was called meaningful awareness, right? What does that mean? I think in the early days of digital financial services, we thought, well, if you give them access to financial services, they'll use them, right? We just thought access meant usage. And that's not the case. And that's not the case in connectivity as well, right? In many financial products and non financial products and connectivity, um, awareness and access does not mean usage, right? And that was our kind of challenge at that moment. And we realized we need to be driving usage. We can't stop the battle at access, that's insufficient. What is preventing the actual usage of these financial services to improve the lives of people, right? Why are we all doing this work? Why do we want to increase people's access to devices, to connectivity, to the web, to all of the offerings and products that connectivity allows a person to access? Because we want them to improve the quality of their lives, right? Through these products. And so I think meaningful connection to me is simply that. It is being able to access connectivity in all its definitions in order to improve your life. I mean, surfing the web for surfing the web is fine, right? But most people instantaneously begin to find value in it. Maybe they are able to get a training that they're not able to get. Maybe they're able to get the access to the market prices of the product that they're selling, usually an agricultural product. That's instantaneous information that is incredibly useful to them so they won't get cheated in the market, right? And then others, I mean, we can talk forever on all the things that they can access. But I think for me, simply put, it's got to improve their lives and the quality of their lives, and ideally improving livelihood.
Absolutely. So Duncan, you mentioned that you've worked in over 25 countries. I'm wondering if you can kind of tell us a little bit about the differing challenges facing underserved communities based on their location. So what differences are you noticing, for example, between one continent to the next, one country to the next in terms of accessing specifically fintech services, but the internet more generally?
I think um, usually there's two or three elements that are sort of quite critical for access to devices, access to connectivity, especially for marginalized populations. One element is just what infrastructure already exists and what already is the norm, right? So, for example, in the Philippines, in Kenya, access to a phone it often is much higher than in some other countries, right? Especially in the early days of when we were working, increasingly access to a phone, especially a basic phone, isn't so hard. Now it's really access to a smartphone. And that when we're talking about connectivity, that's the piece that really builds into that divide. And so I think when you are working in certain geographies in certain countries where already the connectivity infrastructure is excellent, right? And so therefore the cost of just basic connection is lower, let's say India, right? Then access to connectivity is much easier, right? So I would say first and foremost, it's about infrastructure, right? I think, secondly, especially for marginalized people, sometimes often for women, but also other populations, it is cultural norms, right? So, what we hear a lot in some regions, in some countries, and sometimes it's just even not a country, but it's actually a region within a country, is that there are cultural norms where it is not the norm for a woman to have access to a phone. It is not the norm for them to have access to a bank account. That is not their role in the family. That is not their role in the community. And so therefore, why would we give them access, right? And then of course, there's this kind of in some communities, prevailing opinions that access to a phone leads to bad things for the woman, maybe increased harassment and things like that. So I think cultural norms, depending on the geography, depending on a sub-geography, it's not even just a national norm, right? Often it can be even a sub-geography, is critical, is a critical
Mm.
success factor. And then I think
But
third
Jan,
is
I'd like to just bring you in there for a second. So I know that you've been involved in launching product innovation, fintech product innovations across the globe. Um, Obviously, Anthony mentions kind of cultural difficulties in terms of different sub-geographies, different geographies across the world, in terms of how easy or difficult it is to implement those types of products. Can you tell me about some kind of governmental roadblocks that you might face as well, in terms of political roadblocks that might differ from region to region, country to country, from your own experience?
Absolutely, because I think for people to thrive and have access to digital services and financial services, it's really critical for industry and central authorities to work together, regulation to be enabling, policy making to be enabling. So I think you're spot on with that area of discussion for a start. I think there's a couple of different aspects to it. First of all, and linking that to the point that my co-speaker mentions of infrastructure, I think that also connects to affordability of that infrastructure, affordability of the connectivity, affordability of devices, access to devices. I think that is really where policymakers can play a proactive role to incentivize the industry in a way to make those sources available to people at an affordable rate. Really driving the price of connectivity down by allowing for the right licensing structures and so on and so forth. I think that's an important one on the infrastructure level, getting the technology into the hands of people. But I think that's not all, right? It's also often to do with people having the relevant skills, digital skills, financial skills. So I think that really links to policymakers and their agendas on driving financial inclusion, really working together with industry players to educate people, right? People will only get the max out of these services if they know how to operate, if they know what opportunities they may bring for them. And that requires heavy investment on the ground amongst populations, amongst communities, to get them on board and train them, to educate them. And I think the third component that I'd like to highlight there is then, okay, once people have access, once they are skilled, how can you drive the relevance of those services for people? Right? And governments are service providers themselves, right? Or they can boost other service providers to gain access and develop valuable services that are life enhancing. As service providers themselves, they can incentivize people to interact with governmental services over digital channels, improve that customer experience. They can enable third parties to get access to populations, incentivization programs, really helping people to get the max value out of the services so that people really feel that, hey, this is actually improving my life. So I think that really
totally
all
agree.
three are components. Yeah, all three are components where there is a big role for industry and central authorities to collaborate.
Anthony, I'd like to ask you. So obviously, Bart-Jan is talking about some of the challenges faced convincing policymakers. I'm wondering from your own personal experience whether you've also had difficulties in terms of convincing thought leaders from within the digital finance sector to take digital inclusion seriously. Is there a kind of stigma that exists in just focusing on a client base that is already there rather than those who aren't yet connected?
I think so. I believe in taking an ecosystem approach. I think that's been kind of proven, right? Like if you really want to change a market and you want to increase access to X connectivity, digital financial services, digital ecosystem building, uh, if you want to use the power of digital to improve the quality of people's lives, it requires a lot of stakeholders. It's not really easy, right? You can't just like drop in and support one project with one entity and really think you'll see systems change, market change, right? It takes patient capital, it takes time, it takes relationship development, and it takes all the actors, especially policymakers and private sector in partnership with each other to drive change. And I also think you have to be thoughtful in understanding the key performance indicators of all those stakeholders. When I worked with my fintech colleagues, the CEOs of telcos, the CEOs of microfinance institutions and banks and fintechs, I didn't talk about financial inclusion. I didn't talk about including marginalized populations. I talked about, well, what are your numbers? What are you trying to reach? What's your customer acquisition rate? What's your dormancy rate? By the way, that's huge in many countries on a lot of these products, right? People sign up, but then they don't use it. So I'm talking about the things they care about that are still linked to the overall market and improving the lives of all people, right? And then once we have that sense, and then once we can really talk about what is the market opportunity for women, what is the market opportunity for youth, and things like that, I think it's much more, um, it's a solution for a problem that they're facing, right? That's very much around their key performance indicators, right? Their boss is saying, up your numbers, right? Do they care if it's women or whatever? No, right? But isn't it great? Because women actually usually are better customers for many products, right? Based on the data. So I think, yes, it can be challenging, but I think if you take an ecosystem approach, if you understand the relationships between the different actors and what is driving those relationships, which are usually key performance indicators, but there are other things as well in the market, you can bring people together around changing the market. But it's not an easy job, for sure.
Sure. But yeah, let's say obviously I don't expect you to speak in a it's disparaging way to your former employees at GSMA, but let's say someone like Anthony came along and presented this kind of ecosystem approach. Do you feel like there would be a receptive response to this from your colleagues, or do people still take a lot more convincing? Is it still not really understood? Are people still just driven by you know, getting the deals made, which don't necessarily take into account the unconnected members of the world?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And thank you for raising that question and the previous one, actually, because I think there is still a perception that on the one hand, driving financial and digital inclusion, and on the other hand, driving a commercial, sustainable business are at friction with one another. But I don't think that's the case. And I don't think the stakeholders that I've worked with very closely over the past years, working in the space of mobile money on a global scale, have that opinion. In fact, they very well know that it is exactly the bottom of the pyramid that's driving their business. The mobile money industry is a massive industry, and the numbers speak. They tell that vast opportunity just from the State of the Industry report on mobile money that was published a month ago by my team. Think about the account ownership. Active accounts, I agree that there is a big dormant proportion of accounts as well, but active accounts, 435 million active accounts in last year, which was a 14% growth compared to the year before. And the annual revenue per user has gone up from $2.2 in the year 2022 to $3.2 in the last year. So that's a 40% increase. So it may be a high volume, low margin business, but it's a very profitable business. So I think there's a big level of awareness that there's a lot of growth in this industry. You see also how much investment the industry is attracting. and that there is a big opportunity to bring people into the economy, drive financial inclusion, drive digital inclusion, while running a very, very healthy and sustainable commercial business. Those, I think, and there's general awareness about that, can very well go hand in hand.
I'm very pleased to hear that. Oh, sorry.
The only challenge, sorry to interrupt, the only challenge, I completely agree. Obviously, I think we're going to agree on most points. My colleague is brilliant. Is when it's expensive, right? Like the last mile can be urban, and that's usually affordable. We can, as a private sector, they can afford to reach poor people in urban areas. Maybe they may need to adjust the product a bit, but they can afford it. But when it's rural areas, especially quite rural areas,
Yes.
reaching those areas and all the work that has to be done to reach those areas in these fields, right? In digital finance, in connectivity, costs. And
Absolutely.
so the break even point is much higher on those calculations. And that's where it's hard, right? Because those people need the services sometimes even more, right? Or equally to those at the bottom of the pyramid that live in urban areas. However, they're much less likely to be reached. And that's where the challenge is. That's where it's hard to convince, right? That's where money comes in for pilots that you try to create in a way to show the business case if you can, right? But yeah, I think that is the one piece of this, Danny. That's the challenge. Many pieces, but one of the
Sure.
pieces.
So just to clarify, you're saying that those investments in rural areas are really long-term investments, and they might not see the results of those investments in, funding projects like those in the immediate term, and that puts them off. Is that right?
Always. Sometimes it's if they just don't think they'll make money. And then they actually make the investment and they do make money and they reach their break even point earlier than they thought they would. And sometimes, yes, it is a long-term investment where they will make their money, but it will take some time. And probably there are many that maybe they won't break even very fast, right? Much longer. And that's where maybe there needs to be some partnership between government, et cetera. And there are, right? There's like USF funds, Universal Service Funds, that are collected by private sector and other entities within almost every country. And those funds are supposed to be dedicated to reaching those that are hard to reach. But what happens with those funds is very different depending on the country. And so that's probably a discussion maybe for another webinar with experts much more than me. But yeah, that is the case.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'd
I
love
would
to get
agree.
both of your thoughts. Oh, sorry.
May I comment on this one still? Because I would agree on that, and I find it a very interesting point. And it's a well-known issue or problem for the industry, of course, right? If only for geographical reasons. I mean, if you consider that the African continent is 6-7 times larger than Europe, just creating connectivity and a meaningful connectivity across the continent, that's a huge investment, huge capex investment. So to make that worthwhile, I think there needs to be a very sustainable business model in more urban areas that can kind of cover that investment into more rural areas. And I think there is one big word that needs to be tackled, and it's called cash. Right? In many markets in Africa, but also in Asia, and to a large degree in Latin America, are cash driven, and oftentimes more than 90% cash driven. So I think, and that's again a space for collaboration between industry and public actors to replace cash. Because once you start replacing cash and digitizing it, I think then you will start to untap new revenue sources as well that can compensate for that business case or that investment.
I'm really curious to get both of your takes on how partnerships between fintech companies and other non-profit organizations like unconnected.org can contribute to advancing digital inclusion efforts across the globe. Before we actually turn to you guys for your reflections on this, I'd like to just bring in our audience at this point in the conversation. An email address of our phenomenal CCO, Mia Thompson, should like magic appear on the screen now. And we'd also love to hear from you guys in the audience. If you have any thoughts or ideas about how the fintech space and third sector organizations like ours can collaborate in bringing about meaningful change. So please right into us, and let's now hear from our experts. Let's start with you, Jan. What do you think? How can we work together?
I think for a start, the mobile industry and the mobile money industry is all about partnerships, right? Mobile money was developed as kind of a solution for unbanked or underbanked societies, where the banking ecosystem is well developed in developed markets, in Western markets, and maybe in Far East Asian markets, just did not have the physical footprint in many emerging markets to make an impact. While the mobile industry was definitely already there, right? You find mom and pop agent pop-up stores all across the Asian and African continent. So leveraging that network, it could reach people and start offering financial services complementary or on top of telecom services. And it's true that in the initial years, that was very much built in siloed ways. So you had the one mobile money service and the other mobile money service, and they were kind of standing separately next to one another. But I think that has long changed. If you now see where the revenue creation and the diversification of new product lines comes from in the mobile money industry, it's all about partnerships. It's allowing partners to offer their services to people while leveraging the capabilities and the financial services of a mobile money provider, while, of course, building on top of the telecom infrastructure of the operator. So I think that type of model, working together with partners, is a very common approach, and one that there's a lot of openness about, also for players like Unconnected.
And then, Anthony, what more can we do to help also connect with the fintech organizations to convince them that, you know, we are a partner that can work together on a mutual goal? Well, what can we do to help you?
I've seen in the field huge part. I mean, I completely agree with my colleague. Everything's partnerships. You know, and it's partnership between government and private sector. It's got partnerships between NGOs and government and NGOs and private sector that really can drive change. I think there's two or three different ways that fintechs and the digital financial industry has found a lot of value in the NGO community. The first is being anchor partners around developing a business case around a population that an NGO supports, right? So if you have an NGO that's, let's say, a health NGO, and it's supporting a certain population of women and families in a certain region, right, for health services, and they want to digitize health services in that region, right? So you already have a consumer base, right? And that's very attractive to digital finance professionals and fintechs, because they're like, okay, great. I know that I have 150 people that are going to use this product, so my break even point will be lower, right, in this particular place, right? So I will partner with these 3 health clinics, and I will help them digitize their payments, and then patients will begin to pay using my platform, and therefore it's benefit to both hospital and patient, and it's also benefit to private sector. And so we call those anchor partners, right? Because they have an anchor in the community. They have already a group of people that are at a number that's useful, that can bring these financial services to those areas at we hope, at a long-term sustainable way. I think the second is around advocacy and testing. So often a new product will come onto the market, whether it's financial or non-financial, and testing it to ensure that it is useful to marginalized populations, people in rural areas, women, youth, others, to say, hey, your platform's great, but it allows for comments. Often if it's a woman vendor, then they're getting bullied in the comments, right? Or sexually harassed or whatever, right? So I think NGOs can often bring together, often women's groups and women advocates or other advocates from other marginalized populations, to give that feedback in a very structured way, both for products and policymakers, right? And we're seeing more and more of that getting tested in various markets. And I think thirdly, I think the NGO community can bring forward test cases around how reaching hard to reach populations can be sustainable, right? And that's around knowledge production, right? Because private sector doesn't have a lot of time or money or space to do knowledge production. But sometimes if you can show, hey, this is actually sustainable, this has actually worked in this market in a very brief, concise way, then private sector is very attractive to understand what that looks like and think, oh, maybe we can
So
try to
you're saying the
replicate that.
NGOs almost can serve as like a pilot for private sectors, then come in and
Do
expand those projects.
knowledge generation from the pilots, right?
Right.
So often new ideas, how do you disseminate new ideas? Right? How do you create new ideas? And then how do you disseminate new ideas? And I think
Mm.
those are three places that I've seen nonprofit organizations play really important, strong roles in helping drive financial and digital inclusion.
Mm. And another
So
thing,
there's so
then
much more we could say, but yeah.
kind of continuing on that idea of testing out different projects and then expanding them. In terms of the successful efforts that you've seen from fintech companies who are trying to reach rural communities or trying to ensure that their products and services are accessible to people in the global south. I know that in many cases, digital education might be poor. There might be situations in which, for example, tribal languages might not be so commonly spoken and therefore not integrated onto these fintech products. How would you assess the inclusivity of efforts to try of efforts from fintech companies to try and actually make their products usable in these remote communities?
Who do you want to answer first?
Whoever wants to come in on this one, it's a tricky one.
I can jump in with some of my experiences. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to do it. I think you start with the outlining data, the bigger data, saying, well, what kind of access to financial services are there for populations that you're interested in? And almost every country has some research at some frequency around what that looks like. And then the the World Bank conducts their global survey every few years called FINTECH that also covers that data. But I think at a more granular level, one of my favorite tools are customer journey analyses. So you look at a group of customers who are existing or potential customers of a service, financial or non-financial, and then you examine their journey between being non-customer to being what we call a super user. And then what are all of the challenges and barriers that they have along that journey? And then how do you address those barriers? So I think that's one of my favorite tools to really think about, well, what are the challenges and then how do we address those challenges? It's very human-centered design. So you're really focusing on the client and the end clients, but often it brings forward really great insights in a way where you don't have to do a super time-intensive survey, right? You can work with something like 20 people and collect that, and it's still quite useful and quite reflective of the challenges that your client group that you're focused on are facing. And bringing that forward to private sector often is a very positive experience. They're looking for that information, they're looking for that data, but they don't always have the resources to execute it. And so often we'll do it. I've done it in collaboration with them as well. And I think they have many questions they also want to ask. Like you just said, Danny, how much is local language important in the user interface, right? They have all of these questions that we also integrate into that conversation. So that's one of my favorite tools as well. I'll stop there.
Well, Leanne, have you had experience, for example, at GSMA or elsewhere, of using those types of customer journey analysis that Anthony speaks of?
Yeah, definitely, and that's actually my focus. I work on product development and product innovation, so I think it's very important to do research and provide perspectives on a global level. That's indispensable, and we use that a lot. But if you really want to build valuable solutions, it's really market specific, it's really customer segment specific. So you have to go into specific markets, working with specific providers and their customer base. So talking about inclusivity, I can give some examples of what I've been working on over the past couple of years. For instance, it's quite common, and I'm referring to Pakistan, but this holds for many markets where there's a strong mobile money proposition. It's quite common for people when they have issues not to go online to find solutions. They call up the customer call center. That's very common behavior. And we work with a provider in Pakistan, Easy Pesa. They receive literally thousands and thousands of calls on a daily basis. Right? And it's really cumbersome for people then to get something done, because before they can be serviced, they need to identify themselves, they need to be authenticated. We're talking secure financial services, right? So they need to provide IDs, or they need to know their passphrases, or whatever that is. And that in a country with a whole range of local languages, and people that may not always be digitally literate or in general literate. So we conceptualized an idea with them in which none of that is needed. They can just register their voice and identify themselves by their voice. Voice recognition. That has value for people. It increases the customer experience. It has value for the operator. It reduced the call length by up to 30 seconds, which is evidently a cost benefit. And that's a real type of proposition in which, just with one feature, it's not a full-blown solution, just with one feature, you can really add value. One example from one operator in one country, you have to think about all sorts of problems in multiple markets and so on. But I think that's the way to go. Smart product innovations.
Citing that example of Pakistan, so how many people do you think that little change has had a tremendous impact on?
So this is a great example too of a market where there's a very strong collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. So in parallel, the Pakistani regulator has worked on driving biometric authentication and verification procedures in the country. And that means that the entire population of Pakistan in principle has access to such type of verification services. Talking about this specific operator, we're talking 16 million people that can use biometric means to identify themselves.
Wow. That's amazing. That is really amazing. It's powerful to know that such a small change can make such a tremendous impact. I would really like to kind of end our discussion on a positive. I'd like to ask both of you, what gives you hope that we can get to a point one day in which nobody is excluded from digital services that have become part of, I believe you said, more than 50% of people's lives across the world. And of course, if there's any projects or anything you guys would like to promote or mention, now's really kind of your time to shine. And Anthony, let's start with you.
Oh, wasn't ready for this one. I think it's a hard road, especially for women. Um, I, uh, I try to keep my hope. I think the World Economic Forum has said that it'll be more than 100 years before we might reach equality between men and women economically, and then includes access to connectivity devices, financial services, et cetera, which have sort of been my passion for and focus of my work for the last 15, 20 years. I guess my hope is driven by the brilliant young people in the world. I had the opportunity to work closely with collaboration in a huge partnership called the Generation Equality Forum, run by UN Women. And I was so inspired by so many of the groups that I worked with in their how technical they are, right? I mean, of course, they care about women's equality, but like just how much do they understand, and what are they doing to try to increase women's access to land rights, access to financial services, et cetera, right? So I think my hope is in all these amazing generations now and in the future who are much smarter than our generations, and I hope will create innovations and new ways of working together that accelerate that 100 years to a much smaller number, I hope. So that, I guess, yeah, that's what brings me hope.
Fantastic.
But it's hard to keep it sometimes.
Understandable. Understandable. But Jan, what gives you hope?
Yeah, I do understand your concerns as well, actually. And of course, in our daily work, we face so many obstacles. So sometimes it is quite, you take a step back, but you can also take steps forward again. And I think I'm an optimist in that sense. I strongly believe in what I maybe can call technopreneurship. So for me, that's really where technological value, product value, and business value come together. If you look at technological value, I think technologies are becoming more accessible. Price points have gone down of infrastructure, of devices, and that will continue to go down. Certainly at lower end of the spectrum, right? And to give people a starting point into the digital and the financial economy, they don't always need to start at the highest end entry point. So I think cost levels go down and technology will become more widely available. So the second point then is products, so relevance of those products. And that's where I think there's a huge opportunity and also real drive for people that lead the economies to work together and drive relevance for populations, really solving their problems, not imposing our solutions, really understanding what's keeping them busy, how we can improve their lives and build the right solutions to address those needs with them. And the third component is that business value, because I believe that there is a business case. Super young population in the global south, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, super eager, ambitious, a lot of growth in the economies. Sure, not always stable growth, but a lot of opportunity there. If business leaders attack those markets the right way, there's definitely viable business cases to be built and very lucrative business to be built up. And I think that is essential to make things work. Yeah,
Thank you.
That's how I think those three components can work together, and I'm personally very optimistic that they will.
Yeah, I mean, look, from my personal perspective, working alongside an organization like unconnected.org, there are days in which you can feel very optimistic about the amazing progress that's being made. And then it can seem like such an uphill battle, but it is inspiring to hear you both, bring various points of optimism, things that we can focus on, but yet also acknowledging there's plenty more work to do. So I'd like to thank both of you so much for joining me today. Also, I'd like to thank the amazing GSR Foundation for sponsoring us. And most importantly, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in and watching. And let me just add, if any of you would like to get involved, become an ambassador, or even sponsor us with one of our amazing projects, please do connect with us so that we can continue connecting the rest of the world. Thank you so much and take care.